What the DNC is first dealing with, Logan, is what they're worried about is these massive protests. Now, I've seen it in different ways. I worked in New York for the Republican National Convention when I worked for George W. Bush, and we took a leave from the campaign. That was, of course, during the Iraq War and after 9/11, and we decided to do the convention in New York, even though that's not a Republican stronghold in New York City. Yeah, at Madison Square Garden. And there were massive protests. I think the largest protests in history.
I can remember going through it.
Yeah.
And just being like, this is wild.
The whole streets were closed down around it. I mean, but again, then every once in a while, the police would stop it, and you could cross the street.
This was really right after 9/11. A couple years after 9/11.
And this was the anti-war protesters.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it was massive, but it wasn't violent. At least not, it wasn't known to be violent. I'm sure there were some acts of vandalism and things like that.
It was a different time, yeah.
I didn't feel like I was going to, there were so many police out in that time period.
The cops in New York in 2004 were
basically military.
They were going to stop you, yeah.
And now, fast forward, you go to Milwaukee, and we were most of the time inside the security perimeter, though the event we did for the Kansas GOP was outside the security perimeter, and most of the delegates' events are. Yeah. And the streets had been basically like people who lived there just didn't want to be dealing with the traffic. It was very empty. There was a protest zone, but you had to go and find it. That is the same thing in Chicago. The people who want to protest legally, and there's a lot of anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian protesters who have signed up to protest legally, the media will have to go out of its way to show.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up. I thought was interesting is, do you think when they picked Chicago a number of years ago now, they have to pick the convention 4 years usually out, if not more. They thought, well, Chicago, Democrat, run city, we're not going to have massive protests.
Except they did once before.
Okay.
Remember with Jesse Jackson when he ran for president, and there were massive civil rights protests during the Democratic convention. I mean,
I'm just thinking they thought this is a friendlier city, which should be okay. But then all of a sudden you have this
almost a city
issue.
Like, why are you doing it there? Because you're not going to lose Illinois.
Yeah, but you have this issue now that's divided a party, which is Israel,
and it's appearing to be a big issue. And the question is, do the Ilhan Omars and the AOCs, do they go over to those protest zones and try to make it official, like part of the Democrat National Convention, or does the media decide, we're not going to show this? If it doesn't turn violent to the most part, and if they stay in the protest zone, so that it's like, no, this didn't really materialize, and again, I will tell you, that's really going to be up to, one, the protesters. Do they follow the law? And two, does the media want to cover inside the protest zones, or do they break out? Are they so massive, these protests? Because they're saying hundreds of thousands.
Oh, wow.
That's bigger than the protest zone.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
That makes it pretty different. That sounds more like what we saw in New York.
Yeah.
At a time period where we know these protesters.
Blocks and blocks of people.
In a place like Chicago, in states like Illinois, where you're in blue states, especially deeply blue Democrat-controlled cities and states, is that they, this cashless bail system, so that these protesters, as long as they aren't really violent, and there's a line between resisting arrest and becoming violently resisting arrest. But that people like that, if you're resisting arrest, you're blocking traffic, that they may get handcuffed, but then they're just going to get a citation. They're not going to be actually taken in and photographed and go through the whole process of being, in prison and bailed out.
Yep.
And then so basically they'll be back on the street immediately. Yeah. So it won't be the bad actors are taken out on day one, because they're going to get right out unless what they did was really bad. And then they're also talking about, bio attacks. That's not protesting. That's just terrorism. So that distinction. And I want to show some of the footage just so we could see kind of a glimpse of what they're preparing for. This is in New York City. This was an event that Harris and Walz weren't at, but the governor of New York, Hochul, and the mayor of New York were at in Harlem. And these Palestinian protesters there, basically, the news described it as 3 dozen. They just caused a lot of damage. It was at a restaurant. Again, you didn't have the same kind of security that you would if you had executive branch, a vice president there running for president, but there was security there because they had a governor there and the mayor of New York, and they broke through. It wasn't just to protest outside. It was trying to get inside. They caused damage to the restaurant. And again, if it's kind of a small scale version of what Chicago is about to deal with, and they're clearing out courtrooms to be able to process these people very quickly, I think this is when the left kind of has to take its own medicine. When you have those laws on the books that may make sense generally that something is such a low-level offense that we don't want to back up our court system, especially in a place like Chicago where you've got...
Go to a little folding table.
Yeah, where you've got a lot of violent crime going on.
Yeah.
That if it's not real violent crime, that, you know, you let people out. Except for in this case, if you've got hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets and you keep letting the people out who are kind of the agitators each day, they don't mind that. They love the fact of the imagery of them getting arrested. Then they're back on the streets and they get to do their thing. And then, you know, these are just basically fines that they ultimately may have to pay. No jail time. They're not going to be booked like jail time either. They get citations. So I think that again, will be up to how the media wants to cover it. I mean, it's like all of this really comes down to how much time the media spends outside of the security perimeter. And does the security perimeter get breached? Now, if the security perimeter gets breached, that is a very dangerous situation because that means DHS and Secret Service and FBI and all these different government agencies, even National Guard potentially, failed and weren't able to keep the area secure for the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, all these high-level officials and delegates. That, I don't think, is what people are saying yet in the news, but they are certainly kind of hinting that it may look insane.
Yeah.
And I always come down to this. Remember, these media outlets have been building up Kamala Harris. If they don't have to show it, I don't think they will.
No, so if it doesn't just go right, if it stays within the protest zone.
Them, like if you can't, CNN was inside the perimeter, their whole like CNN compound.
Yeah.
So unless the protesters got through the security zone, CNN could show you just a peaceful.
Well, the question that was brought up in our meeting before this was, will it expand to actually members that are there?
Right.
Will the protest actually not be just random people on the streets,
but delegates?
Yeah.
And remember, these are the delegates who supported Harris. These were Joe Biden's delegates. So, I mean, I don't know how many people in there are so radical because to be that delegate, you had to be on that side. You're not Ilhan Omar. First of all, they support Walt. So what are they going to do? Why would they be protesting? I think that's where, again, you might see a few people. Occasionally it happens. It happened at the Republican convention when President Trump first ran. There was that move to try to take him out and put others forward. Sure. It wasn't violent. It was what sometimes happened on a convention floor, but it was certainly something you could show in the media. I'm sure conservative media will show these protests.
And the actual Democrat camp, the convention portion of this, the election portion, is over. Right? That all happened.
Right.
She's been selected. They'll probably do the role.
They'll do the role.
So those people get their 2 seconds of screen time.
Exactly. And again, I have no problem with peaceful protest, even if it's on a large scale that takes, these people got permits, and I disagree completely with their positions, their anti-Semitism and their anti-Israel views. But at the same time, if they are following the law to get their permits, that's a very different kind of protest than chaos.
Yeah.
Chaos to me is these are non-permitted individuals who show up to cause criminal
bombing,
conduct.
city burning.
Criminal conduct.
Yes.